Dominic Hayes sat at his usual table at LeBlanc, Manhattan's most expensive restaurant. The waiter poured his $1,000 wine while Dominic checked his phone. Another successful deal. $20 million in profit. Just another Tuesday. For New York's most ruthless businessman. "Would you like me to wrap up your leftovers, Mr. Hayes?" the waiter asked. "No, throw them away," Dominic said without looking up. Half his steak remained on the plate, along with most of the sides. He never finished his meals. Why should he? He could order anything he wanted, any time he wanted. A small movement caught his eye. A boy, no more than 10 years old, stood near his table. His clothes were dirty and torn. His dark hair was messy and his face was smudged with dirt. But his eyes, there was something about those eyes that made Dominic uncomfortable. The boy looked at the food on Dominic's plate, then quickly looked away. His thin shoulders hunched forward as if trying to make himself smaller. "What are you doing here?" Dominic's voice cut through the air like ice. "This is a private establishment." "I'm sorry, sir," the boy whispered. I haven't eaten in 2 days." Dominic's lip curled in disgust. "And that's my problem because..." He looked around the restaurant. "Where's security? How did this trash get in here?" The boy flinched at the word trash, but he didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on the food. "Please, sir, just the leftovers. I'll clean tables or wash dishes or..." "Pathetic," Dominic spat. "This is what's wrong with society. People like you, begging instead of working. No wonder you have nothing. You probably come from a whole family of losers." The boy's eyes filled with tears, but he blinked them back. "My mom wasn't a loser," he said quietly. "She worked 3 jobs. She tried really hard." "Well, clearly not hard enough," Dominic sneered. He raised his hand to call security, and that's when he saw it, a flash of gold on the boy's wrist. Dominic's heart stopped. The bracelet was old and slightly tarnished, but he would know it anywhere. 2 intertwined dragons, their eyes set with tiny rubies. He had spent months saving his allowance to buy matching ones for himself and his twin brother David when they were 12. David had worn his every day until he died 10 years ago. That bracelet? Dominic's voice shook. "Where did you get it?" The boy instinctively covered it with his other hand. "It was my mom's. She gave it to me before she went to heaven. She said it belonged to my uncle, but he never came to find us." The restaurant spun around Dominic. He gripped the table to steady himself. "Your mother," he whispered. "What was her name?" "Sarah Martinez," the boy said. "She worked here, cleaning at night, until she got sick." Sarah Martinez. David's girlfriend, from college. The one their father had paid to disappear when she got pregnant. The one David had never stopped looking for. "And your name?" Dominic could barely get the words out. "David," the boy said. "David Martinez Hayes. Mom said she named me after my dad." Dominic's legs gave out. He sank back into his chair, staring at his nephew. David's son. His brother's child had been starving on the streets while he dined on $1,000 steaks. The restaurant manager approached, ready to remove the boy, but Dominic held up his hand. "He stays," Dominic said, his voice hoarse. "He's family." "The boy?" David looked confused. "Sir?" Dominic stood up slowly and knelt in front of his nephew. "I'm your Uncle Dominic," he said, "and I'm so sorry it took me so long to find you." Young David's eyes widened. His hand went to the bracelet. "Mom she said my uncle was rich and powerful, but she also said he had a good heart like my dad. She said someday you'd find me." Dominic felt tears burning in his eyes. He hadn't cried since David's funeral. "Your mom was right about some things," he said. "I am rich and powerful, but she was wrong about my heart. I haven't had a good heart for a long time, but maybe you can help me find it again." He held out his hand, showing his own bracelet, identical to the one the boy wore. "What do you say, David? Would you like to come home with me?" The boy looked at the matching bracelets, then at Dominic's face. Slowly, hesitantly, he took his uncle's hand. Security guards and restaurant staff stood frozen, watching as New York's most notorious businessman hugged a dirty homeless boy crying openly in the middle of Manhattan's finest restaurant. Outside, the city continued its busy evening rush. But inside LeBlanc, a miracle was happening. A broken family was beginning to heal, all because of a golden bracelet and a mother's dying wish. The ride to Dominic's penthouse was silent. Young David pressed his face against the limousine window, watching the city lights blur past. His dirty sneakers barely touched the leather seats, as if he was afraid to leave a mark. "Are you hungry?" Dominic asked, still trying to process everything that had happened. David nodded shyly. "Yes, sir." "You don't have to call me sir. I'm your uncle." "Yes." "Uncle Dominic." The words hit Dominic like a punch to the gut. Uncle Dominic. He should have been Uncle Dominic for the past 10 years. Instead, he'd been living his privileged life while his nephew struggled on the streets. The elevator opened directly into Dominic's penthouse. David's eyes went wide at the sight of the massive apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows showed the glittering New York skyline. Everything was sleek, modern and expensive, and completely unlived in. No photos on the walls, no personal touches. Nothing that made it feel like a home. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Dominic called out. His housekeeper appeared from the kitchen, stopping short when she saw David. "Dios mío," she whispered, taking in the boy's appearance. "Mrs. Rodriguez, this is David. He's my nephew. He'll be living with us now." Dominic's voice left no room for questions. "Could you please make him something to eat and then run a bath?" "Of course, Mr. Hayes." Mrs. Rodriguez's kind eyes softened as she looked at David. "Come with me, Niño. Let's get some food in your stomach." While David ate 3 plates of Mrs. Rodriguez's chicken soup, Dominic made phone calls to his lawyer, to his PR team, to the private investigator who had failed to find Sarah Martinez 10 years ago. "I want everything," he barked into the phone. "Medical records, death certificate, where she lived, where she worked, everything about my nephew's life for the past 10 years. And I want it tonight." David's quiet voice interrupted his calls. "Uncle Dominic." Dominic turned around. The boy stood in the doorway of his home office, wrapped in a fluffy white bathrobe that was too big for him. His hair was clean and damp from the bath. Without the dirt, his resemblance to Dominic's brother was startling. "Yes, David? David hesitated. "I have something for you. Mom told me to give it to you if I ever found you." He pulled a worn envelope from the pocket of his old jeans, which Mrs. Rodriguez had folded neatly despite their poor condition. Dominic's hands shook as he took the envelope. Inside was a letter, the paper thin and delicate with age. "Dear Dominic," he read aloud, "if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and David has finally found his way to you. I want you to know that I never spent your father's money. I couldn't. Not after what happened with David. Your David, my David, our David, who loved us both so much. I know you probably hate me for disappearing, but your father made it clear what would happen if I didn't. He said he'd make sure I lost my baby one way or another. I couldn't risk it, not when I was carrying the last piece of David I had left. I named him David because I wanted him to be strong and kind like his father. I gave him the bracelet so he would always have a connection to his family, to you. I told him stories about his brave father and his smart uncle who would find him someday. Please, Dominic, love him like David would have. Give him the life I couldn't, and maybe in time you can forgive me for keeping him from you. With love, Sarah." Dominic looked up from the letter. David stood quietly, watching him with those eyes that looked so much like his brother's. "Did you read this?" Dominic asked. Softly, David shook his head. "Mom said it was only for you. She made me promise." Dominic walked over and knelt in front of his nephew. "Your mother was an incredible woman, and I'm the one who needs to ask for forgiveness. I should have looked harder. I should have found you both. Mom said you would find me when the time was right," David said. "She said everything happens when it's supposed to." Dominic pulled the boy into a hug, not caring that his $1,000 suit was getting wet from David's damp hair. "From now on," he promised, "nobody will ever separate us again." In his mind, he could almost hear his brother's voice. "Take care of my boy, Dom, like you always took care of me." Mrs. Rodriguez watched from the doorway, wiping tears from her eyes. In all the years she'd worked for Mr. Hayes, she'd never seen him show emotion, never seen him hug anyone, never seen him care about anything except money and power. But now, as she watched him hold his nephew, she saw something change in her employer's face. The hard lines softened. The cold eyes warmed. It was as if a frozen heart was finally beginning to thaw. "Come on," Dominic said, standing up. "Let's find you a bedroom. Tomorrow we'll go shopping for new clothes, and then we need to talk about school." "School?" David's eyes lit up. "I haven't been to school since Mom got sick." "Well, that's going to change. You're a Hayes now, and Hayes men get the best education money can buy." As they walked down the hallway, David's small hand slipped into Dominic's. The golden bracelets on their wrists caught the light, glinting like promises finally kept. In his massive penthouse that had never felt like a home, Dominic Hayes realized that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't the ones you can buy. Sometimes they come in the form of a little boy with your brother's eyes and a heart big enough to forgive. The news spread through New York's high society like wildfire. Dominic Hayes, the city's most ruthless businessman, had taken in a homeless boy claiming to be his nephew. The gossip columns couldn't get enough of it. "It's a scam," Victoria Sinclair said, setting down her champagne glass at the charity gala. She was Dominic's ex-fiancée, and she still hadn't forgiven him for breaking off their engagement 3 years ago. Some woman probably trained that boy to con Dominic. Everyone knows how much he loved his brother. I heard the boy even has David's old bracelet, whispered Margaret Wells, another socialite. But it could be a fake. Those street people can be very clever. They didn't know that Dominic could hear every word from his spot near the ballroom's entrance. 2 weeks ago, their words would have made him angry. Now, they just made him sad. These were the people he had called friends. This was the world he had chosen over finding his family. "Uncle Dominic?" David tugged at his new suit jacket. It was his first formal event, and he looked uncomfortable but determined. "Can we go home soon?" Dominic smiled down at his nephew. "Just a little longer, buddy. I need to talk to some business partners." The boy nodded bravely, but Dominic could see how overwhelmed he was. The past 2 weeks had been a whirlwind of changes. New clothes, new doctors, new tutors to help him catch up on his missed schooling. David tried so hard to adjust, to be worthy of his new life, that sometimes it broke Dominic's heart. "Mr. Hayes," George Anderson, Dominic's biggest business rival, approached with a fake smile. "And this must be the famous nephew we've all heard about." David moved closer to Dominic, sensing the tension. "Hello, Mr. Anderson," Dominic said coldly. "You?" "No, it's funny," Anderson said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "I was just talking to my private investigator. He found some interesting information about Sarah Martinez's last few years." Dominic's hand tightened on David's shoulder. "Whatever you think you found, Anderson, I suggest you keep it to yourself." "Oh, but don't you want to know? About the gambling debts? The men she was involved with? The times she left the boy alone while she—" "Stop it!" David suddenly shouted. The nearby conversations fell silent. "Don't talk about my mom like that. She worked hard. She got sick because she worked so many jobs to take care of me." Anderson stepped back, startled by the outburst. Dominic knelt down next to his nephew, seeing the tears in his eyes. "David, look at me," he said gently. "Your mother was an amazing woman. Mr. Anderson and people like him, they don't understand what it means to struggle, to sacrifice everything for someone you love. But he said those things to hurt us, because he's jealous, because some people can't stand to see others happy." Dominic stood up, facing Anderson. "And because some people forget that I still own enough shares in their company to make their life very, very difficult." Anderson's face paled. "Dominic, I didn't mean—" "Mrs. Rodriguez," Dominic called to his housekeeper, who had accompanied them to help with David. "Please take David to get some ice cream. I need to have a private conversation with Mr. Anderson." After they left, Dominic's face changed. The warmth disappeared, replaced by the cold expression that had earned him his reputation. "Listen carefully," he said quietly. "If you ever speak about Sarah Martinez again, if you ever try to hurt my nephew, I will destroy everything you've built. Do you understand?" Anderson nodded quickly and hurried away. Victoria and her gossiping friends suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere. The crowd parted around Dominic like water around a rock. But when David returned with a chocolate ice cream cone, Dominic's smile was back. "Ready to go home, buddy?" "Yes, please." David hesitated. Uncle Dominic? I'm sorry I yelled. Mom always said it's not polite to raise your voice. Your mom was right about being polite, but she would also be proud that you defended her. Dominic straightened David's tie. You know what? I think we've had enough fancy parties for a while. How about tomorrow we go to the park instead? Maybe get hot dogs from that cart you like? David's face lit up. Really, but you said hot dog carts are unsanitary. Well, maybe your old uncle is learning that some of the best things in life aren't perfect. Dominic looked at their matching bracelets. Sometimes they're just real. That night after David was asleep, Dominic sat in his office looking at old photos. He found one of himself and David, his brother David, at a similar charity gala years ago. They were both laughing at some forgotten joke, their golden bracelets visible in the flash of the camera. I'm trying, brother, he whispered to the photo. I'm trying to be the man you always thought I could be. His phone buzzed with a message from his investigator. More details about Sarah's final years had been uncovered. Hospital bills she couldn't pay, letters she had written to Dominic, that were intercepted by his father's staff. A small diary where she wrote about her hopes for her son. Dominic closed the file without reading further. The past was the past. What mattered now was the little boy sleeping down the hall, the boy who had his brother's eyes and his sister-in-law's courage. Tomorrow they would eat hot dogs in the park. Tomorrow they would continue building their new life together. Tomorrow they would prove that sometimes family isn't about where you come from, but about who you choose to become. And maybe, just maybe, they would both finally heal. Dominic sat in the waiting room of Dr. Harrison's private school, his leg bouncing nervously. It had been a month since he found David, and today was the entrance interview. The best private school in Manhattan didn't usually accept students mid-year, but the Hayes name and a generous donation had opened doors. Mr. Hayes, the secretary called. Dr. Harrison will see you now. David looked terrified in his new school uniform. Dominic squeezed his hand as they walked into the office. Dr. Harrison was a stern-looking woman with steel-gray hair and glasses. She looked up from David's file with a frown. Mr. Hayes, while we appreciate your generous contribution to our science department, I have serious concerns. She tapped the papers on her desk. Your nephew has missed almost 2 years of formal education. Our standards are extremely high. I know David can catch up, Dominic said. He's been working with tutors every day. It's not just the academics. Dr. Harrison's voice was cold. Our students come from New York's finest families. The parents are concerned about their children associating with someone who was recently homeless. David's shoulders slumped. Dominic felt anger rising in his chest. My nephew, he said quietly, comes from one of New York's finest families, the Hayes family. Or does our name only matter when you're cashing my checks? Uncle Dominic, David whispered. It's okay, we can find another school. No, it's not okay. Dominic stood up. Dr. Harrison, let me tell you about my nephew. His mother worked 3 jobs to give him a better life. Even when they had nothing, she made sure he read. Books from the library. She taught him to be kind and brave and honest, things your finest families seem to have forgotten. Dr. Harrison blinked, surprised by his passion. But if you don't want him here, Dominic continued, that's fine. I'll build my own school. One that judges children by their character, not their bank accounts. Now, Mr. Hayes, Dr. Harrison backtracked quickly. Let's not be hasty. Perhaps we could give David a trial period. No. David's quiet voice made them both turn. I don't want to go here. Not if they don't want me. Dominic looked at his nephew with pride. You're right, buddy. Let's go. As they walked out, Dr. Harrison called after them. Mr. Hayes, think about what you're doing. No other top school will accept him. In the car, David was quiet. I'm sorry, Uncle Dominic. I know you wanted me to go to a good school. Hey, look at me. Dominic turned to face his nephew. You just taught me something important back there. Sometimes the things we think are best aren't best at all. That evening, while David was doing his lessons with Mrs. Rodriguez, Dominic made calls. Not to other private schools, but to education experts, children's psychologists, teachers who had experience with trauma and interrupted schooling. I want to create something new, he told them. A school that helps kids who've had a rough start. Kids like my nephew. His lawyer thought he was crazy. A school for underprivileged children. Dominic, think about your reputation. Your business partners won't understand. Then I'll find new business partners, Dominic said simply. Later that night, he found David in the living room, looking at his mother's photo. They had found it in her old apartment, along with a box of David's baby pictures that the landlord had kept. Mum would have loved you now, David said softly. You're so different from what she remembered. What do you mean? She said you used to be angry all the time. After my dad died, she said you stopped smiling. Dominic sat next to his nephew. I was angry at the world, at my father, at myself. I was angry for so long I forgot how to be anything else. But you're not angry anymore. No. Dominic touched his bracelet. It's hard to be angry when you have someone showing you what really matters. David leaned against his uncle's shoulder. Can I tell you a secret? Sometimes I still get scared. Scared of what? That this isn't real. That I'll wake up and be back on the streets, or that you'll decide I'm too much trouble. Dominic's heart broke a little. He pulled David into a tight hug. Listen to me. This is real. You're my family. The only family I have left. And nothing in this world could make me let you go. Promise, I promise. Dominic held up his wrist, the golden bracelet catching the light. See this? Your dad and I made a promise when we got these, to always be there for each other. Now I'm making the same promise to you. David smiled, touching his own bracelet. Uncle Dominic, I have an idea about the school. Oh yeah? Maybe. Maybe we could name it after Mom. The Sarah Martinez School? Dominic felt tears in his eyes. I think that's perfect, buddy. And you know what? Maybe you can help me design. Tell me what kids like you really need. Kids like me, brave kids, strong kids. Kids who never give up no matter how hard things get. That night, after David went to bed, Dominic worked late in his office. But instead of looking at profit margins and stock reports, he was sketching plans for a school, a place where children would be valued for their hearts, not their bank accounts. A place that would make his brother proud. On his desk, next to his computer, sat Sarah's photo. She was smiling, young David on her lap. Both of them wearing simple clothes but looking happy. Thank you, he whispered to the photo, for keeping him safe, for teaching him everything I had forgotten. I promise I'll spend the rest of my life making up for lost time. Outside his office window, New York glittered with its usual glamour. But Dominic Hayes, once the city's coldest businessman, didn't see the lights anymore. All he saw was a future bright with possibility, a future where love and second chances meant more than all the money in the world. The construction of the Sarah Martinez School was all over the news. Some called it Dominic Hayes' midlife crisis. Others said it was a publicity stunt, but Dominic didn't care about the gossip anymore. He had more important things to worry about. Uncle Dominic! David burst into his home office one morning, waving. The newspaper. Look, they wrote about Mom. The article was about Sarah's life, her struggles as a single mother, and her dream of giving her son a good education. Dominic had made sure the reporter told the real story, not the twisted version his enemies had tried to spread. She would have been so happy, David said, his eyes shining. A whole school named after her. But their happy moment was interrupted by Dominic's phone ringing. It was his secretary, sounding worried. Mr. Hayes, your father is here. Dominic felt his blood run cold. Richard Hayes, the man who had driven Sarah away, who had kept David from his family for 10 years, was waiting in the lobby of Hayes Tower. Send him up to my office, Dominic said. Then he turned to David. Buddy, I need you to stay with Mrs. Rodriguez for a while. I have an important meeting. David's smile faded. He was getting better at reading his uncle's moods. Is something wrong? No, everything's fine. Just boring business stuff. Dominic tried to sound casual. Why don't you show Mrs. Rodriguez the article about your mum? But as he walked into his office at Hayes Tower 20 minutes later, Dominic's hands were shaking. He hadn't spoken to his father since David's funeral 10 years ago. Richard Hayes stood at the window, looking out at the city. He was older now, his hair completely white, but he still had the same cold presence that had dominated Dominic's childhood. Hello, Father. Richard turned around slowly. So it's true, you're throwing away the family's reputation for some street urchin. That street urchin is your grandson. Dominic's voice was steel. David's son. The boy you forced Sarah to hide. I did what was necessary. Richard's face showed no emotion. The Hayes name means something in this city. We couldn't have it tainted by some gold-digging waitress and her bastard child. Her name was Sarah Martinez, Dominic said through clenched teeth. And she was worth 1,000 of you. She raised that boy with nothing, no money, no help, no family. While we lived in luxury, she worked herself to death trying to give him a better life. And now you're going to throw away everything we built. For what? Guilt? No. Dominic walked to his desk and picked up a framed photo, David and him at the park, both smiling, their golden bracelets glinting in the sun. For love, for family, for all the things you never understood. Richard's eyes narrowed. I'm warning you, Dominic. If you do this, if you build this school, if you keep parading that boy around, I'll have no choice but to act. Are you threatening me? I'm protecting our family's legacy. Dominic laughed, but there was no humor in it. Our legacy? Let me tell you about our legacy, Father. Our legacy is a woman who died alone because we abandoned her. A little boy who slept on the streets while his uncle lived in a penthouse. That's the Hayes legacy you're so proud of. You're making a mistake, Richard warned. The board won't stand for this. Your investors won't understand. Then let them leave. Dominic sat down at his desk. I'm not that man anymore. The one who cared more about money than people. The one who let you turn him into a copy of yourself. You'll regret this. No, Father. The only thing I regret is not finding David sooner. Not standing up to you when Sarah needed help. But that changes now. Dominic pressed a button on his phone. A security will escort you out. Don't come back. As the security guards appeared, Richard turned back one last time. That boy will destroy everything you've built. No, Dominic said quietly. He's already helped me build something better. After his father left, Dominic sat alone in his office for a long time. His hands were still shaking, but now from anger rather than fear. All those years, he had been so afraid of disappointing his father. So desperate for approval that he had become someone he hated. When he finally got home that evening, he found David and Mrs. Rodriguez in the kitchen. They were baking cookies, something that would have been unthinkable in his house a few months ago. Uncle Dominic, David's face was smudged with flour. We made chocolate chip your favorite. Looking at his nephew's happy face, Dominic felt the last of his father's poison drain away. This was real wealth. This was true success. Not the empty towers or the cold boardrooms, but the warmth of a kitchen filled with the smell of cookies and the sound of laughter. Hey, buddy, he said, hugging David tight. How about we eat these cookies, and I tell you some stories about your dad? The good ones, about when we were kids, about how he always stood up for what was right, no matter what anyone said. David's eyes lit up. Really? You never talk about him? Well, it's time I started, because you're just like him, you know, strong and brave and kind. As they sat at the kitchen table, sharing cookies and stories, Dominic touched his bracelet. He could almost hear his brother's voice. You finally got it right, Dom. This is what matters. And for the first time in 10 years, Dominic Hayes felt truly, completely at peace. The board meeting was worse than Dominic expected. Richard Hayes had been busy, turning board members against his son, spreading doubts about Dominic's mental state since taking in his nephew. The company's stock has dropped 15%. Thomas Wheeler, the longest-serving board member, announced, Your father is right, Dominic. This school project, this sudden interest in charity, it's making our investors nervous. Our investors? Dominic looked around the table. Or my father? The fact is, Jennifer Roberts, another board member, chimed in, You've changed. The ruthless businessman who built this company seems to have disappeared. And now we hear you're selling your shares to fund this school? Yes, Dominic said simply. I'm selling 30% of my holdings. The Sarah Martinez School needs proper funding. The room erupted in protests. Dominic let them shout. His mind wandered to that morning when he had dropped David off at his temporary school. His nephew had been nervous about a math test, but determined to do well. "I studied really hard, Uncle Dominic," David had said. "I want to make you proud." "I'm already proud of you, buddy," Dominic had told him, "every single day." Now, looking at these angry faces around the conference table, Dominic wondered how he had ever thought these people were his friends. "There's something else," Wheeler said, his voice grave. "Your father has proof that the boy's mother was involved with questionable people. If this gets out, the Hayes name—" "Stop." Dominic's voice cut through the room like a blade. "If any of you, if my father tries to smear Sarah's name again, I will personally make sure every dirty secret in this company comes to light. And believe me, I know them all." The threat hung in the air. Several board members shifted uncomfortably. "Now," Dominic continued, "you have two choices. Either accept that Hayes Industries is changing, becoming something better than a soulless money machine, or buy me out completely. I don't care anymore." "You don't mean that," Jennifer gasped. "This company is your life." "No," Dominic smiled. "My life is picking up my nephew from school, helping him with homework, watching him grow into an amazing young man. The company? It's just money." He stood up, straightening his tie. "You have until the end of the week to decide. Now, if you'll—" "Excuse me, I promised David I'd be at his school play." The elevator ride down to the lobby felt like freedom. For the first time in his adult life, Dominic wasn't afraid of losing everything, because now he knew what everything really meant. But when he reached his car, his driver looked worried. "Mr. Hayes, there's been a call from David's school." Dominic's heart stopped. What happened? The boy had some kind of panic attack during rehearsal. They said he's okay, but Dominic was already running back to the elevator, heading for the parking garage and his personal car. The school was 15 minutes away, but he made it in 10. He found David in the nurse's office, looking small and pale. Mrs. Rodriguez was already there, holding his hand. "Uncle Dominic," David's voice shook. "I'm sorry, I ruined everything." "Hey, no." Dominic knelt beside him. "What happened, buddy?" "It was the play. I was doing good, remembering all my lines. But then I saw Grandpa Richard in the audience." Dominic felt cold anger rising in his chest. "What?" "He didn't do anything," David said quickly. "He just sat there. But he looked so angry. And I remembered what Mom used to say about how he made her leave, and I got scared he would make me leave too." "David, look at me." Dominic took his nephew's hands, their bracelets touching. "Nobody, not even Richard Hayes, can take you away from me. You're my son now. Do you understand?" My son. It was the first time he had said it. Out loud. David's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were happy tears. "Really," he whispered, "like legally?" "Well, not yet." Dominic smiled. "But if you want, we can change that. I've been talking to my lawyers about adoption papers." David threw his arms around his uncle's neck. Yes, I want that." Mrs. Rodriguez wiped her eyes, muttering something in Spanish about miracles and angels. "Okay then." Dominic hugged his nephew, his son, tight. "Let's go home, and tomorrow we'll start the paperwork to make it official." But as they walked to the car, Dominic's phone buzzed with messages from the board meeting. His father was making moves to force a vote of no confidence. The company he had spent his life building was slipping away. Looking at David's happy face as they drove home, Dominic realized he didn't care. Let them take the company. Let them take the money. They couldn't take what really mattered. That evening, as they sat in their favorite pizza place, because David had declared it was a pizza kind of day, Dominic watched his nephew chattering excitedly about the adoption. The boy's golden bracelet caught the light, matching the one on Dominic's wrist. "You know what, Dad?" David said suddenly, testing out the new word. "Mom was right about you." "What do you mean?" "She always said there was a good person inside you, just waiting to come out. She said my dad knew it too. That's why they never gave up hope that you'd find me someday." Dominic felt tears in his eyes. "Your mom was a very wise woman." "The wisest," David agreed, taking another slice of pizza. "So, when do I get to help design my new room at the school?" "Your room? Well, yeah, you're the principal, right? So we'll live there?" Dominic laughed. I hadn't thought about that, but you know what? That's not a bad idea at all. Outside, New York's elite were probably gossiping about Dominic Hayes' downfall. But inside a small pizza place, a father and son were planning their future, and it was more beautiful than any corner office could ever be. The adoption hearing was set for Tuesday morning. Dominic had bought David a new suit for the occasion, and Mrs. Rodriguez had spent an hour trying to tame the boy's unruly hair. "Stop fidgeting," she scolded gently, adjusting David's tie. "You look very handsome." But as they walked into the courthouse, Dominic felt his stomach drop. Richard Hayes was standing in the lobby, talking to a woman Dominic recognized as a social worker. "Uncle Dominic?" David grabbed his hand. "What's he doing here?" Before Dominic could answer, his father approached them. "I'm sorry it had to come to this," Richard said, not sounding sorry at all. "But you've left me no choice." The social worker stepped forward. "Mr. Hayes, I'm Clara Bennett from Child Services. We need to discuss some concerns that have been raised about David's placement with you." "What concerns?" Dominic's voice was ice. "Your father has provided documentation suggesting you're mentally unstable. The sudden personality changes, giving away your fortune, the obsession with this school project." She consulted her notes. "There's also the matter of your working hours, the lack of a proper family support system." "This is ridiculous," Dominic interrupted. "I have references, doctor's reports. David's teachers will tell you how well he's doing. Nevertheless, we have to investigate any serious allegations." Clara looked at David. "Honey, would you come with me for a moment? We need to talk privately." David's grip on Dominic's hand tightened. "No, I want to stay with my dad." Richard's face darkened at the word dad. "You see," he told Clara, "he's already corrupted the boy, making him forget his real father, my son, David." "That's not true," David's voice echoed in the lobby. "I know all about my real dad. Uncle Dominic tells me stories about him every night, about how brave he was and kind, and how he would have loved me if he had known about me." Clara looked surprised at David's outburst. "And I have proof that I belong with Uncle Dominic." David pulled up his sleeve, showing his bracelet. "See? My dad gave this to my mom, and Uncle Dominic has the same one. We're family, real family." Dominic felt tears in his eyes. His brave, wonderful boy. "Ms. Bennett," he said quietly, "I know my father has influence. I know he can make things difficult for anyone who goes against him. But please look at the facts. Look at David's school records since he came to live with me. Look at his medical reports, showing how he's finally at a healthy weight. Look at his therapy evaluations, where he talks about feeling safe and loved for the first time since his mother died." Clara hesitated, looking between Dominic and Richard. "And yes," Dominic continued, "I am giving away my fortune to build a school for kids like David, kids who deserve a chance. If that makes me mentally unstable in my father's eyes, then so be it." "You're making a scene," Richard hissed. "No, Father, I'm finally making things right." Just then, Dominic's lawyer hurried up to them, carrying a file. "I'm sorry I'm late, but I have something you need to see, Ms. Bennett." He handed her a stack of papers. "These are letters from Sarah Martinez to Richard Hayes, begging him to let her tell Dominic about his nephew. Bank records showing the money he paid her to disappear, and most importantly, his threats to take the baby away if she didn't comply." Clara's eyes widened as she read. Richard's face went pale. "You kept these?" Richard demanded. "After all these years?" "No," Dominic said. "Sarah did. She left them with her landlord, along with instructions to give them to David when he turned 18. The landlord contacted me last week. Mr. Hayes." "Richard Hayes," Clara said, her voice professional but cold. "I think we need to discuss these documents with the family court judge, and I'll be recommending a full investigation into your actions regarding Sarah Martinez and her son." Richard straightened his tie. "You'll regret this, Dominic. All of you." But as he stormed out, his threats seemed hollow. The mighty Richard Hayes, finally exposed for what he was. "Dad?" David's voice was small. "Are we still getting adopted today?" Dominic knelt down to his level. "You bet we are, buddy. Nothing's going to stop us now." Clara Bennett watched them with a slight smile. "The hearing is in 20 minutes. I'll be recommending immediate approval of the adoption. And Mr. Hayes, what you're doing with the school, it's admirable." 2 hours later, it was official. David Martinez Hayes became David Martinez Hayes Thompson, legally and forever Dominic's. Soon as they walked out of the courthouse, David looked up at the bright blue sky. Mom would be so happy right now. Yes, she would. Dominic squeezed his son's shoulder. How about we celebrate? Anywhere you want to go. Can we go to the school site? I want to tell Mom about it. I know she's not really there, but she's there, Dominic said softly. In every brick we're laying, in every life we're going to help, she's there. They drove to the construction site where the Sarah Martinez school was taking shape. The workers had become used to seeing them there, the businessman and the boy who always seemed to have suggestions about what kids would like in a school. Standing in what would be the main courtyard, David touched his bracelet. You know what? I just realized. When the school opens, other kids like me will have a chance. They won't have to be scared or hungry or alone. That's right. And maybe, David hesitated, maybe someday I can help run it, like when I'm older, to help other kids the way you helped me. Dominic felt his heart swell with pride. I think that's a wonderful idea. The Hayes-Thompson legacy, helping people instead, of just making money. As the sun set behind the half-built school, casting long shadows across the construction site, Dominic looked at his son. The boy who had changed everything, who had reminded him what really mattered in life. Hey, Dad, David said suddenly, I love you. It was the first time he had said it. Dominic pulled him into a tight hug, their matching bracelets glinting in the fading light. I love you too, son, more than anything in this world. And somewhere, Dominic was sure, Sarah and his brother were smiling down on them. Their family finally whole, their love finally home. The opening day of the Sarah Martinez school was just 2 weeks away. Construction. Workers rushed to finish the final details, while Dominic and David walked through the halls, checking every classroom, every corner. Look, Dad. David pointed excitedly at the library. They're putting up Mum's picture. The large portrait of Sarah Martinez smiled down at them from above the library entrance. She looked young and beautiful, her kind eyes seeming to watch over the space that would soon be filled with children's laughter. Perfect spot for it, Dominic agreed. She always loved books. But their happy moment was interrupted by Dominic's phone ringing. It was his lawyer and his voice was urgent. Dominic, we have a problem. Your father's filed an injunction to stop the school from opening. He's claiming you used company funds illegally to build it. That's impossible, Dominic said. I used my own money. I have all the documentation. He's saying some of the early funding came from Hayes Industries accounts. Before you sold your shares, he's demanding a full audit. David tugged at his father's sleeve. Dad, what's wrong? Dominic covered the phone. Nothing, buddy, just some paperwork problems. But his heart was racing. He knew his father was lying, but Richard Hayes had judges and politicians in his pocket. He could tie up the school in legal battles for months. There's more, the lawyer continued. He's also pushing for a psychiatric evaluation. Says your recent behavior shows mental instability that could put the students at risk. Dominic felt cold anger rising in his chest. Even after losing the adoption battle, his father wouldn't give up trying to destroy everything he and David had built. That evening, after David was asleep, Dominic sat in his office, looking at old financial records. Everything was legal. Everything was documented. But would that matter against his father's influence? A soft knock at the door made him look up. David stood there in his pajamas, his hair messy from sleep. I heard you talking on the phone earlier, he said. Grandpa Richard is trying to stop the school, isn't he? Sometimes Dominic forgot how perceptive his son was. Come here, buddy. He patted the chair next to him. David sat down, his golden bracelet catching the light. You know what Mom used to say when things got really hard? What's that? She said. That good people win in the end. Not because they're stronger or richer, but because they have something worth fighting for. Dominic pulled his son into a hug. Your mom was very wise. So we're not giving up, right? No way. But it might get tough for a while. The newspapers might say bad things about us again. David shrugged. They already say bad things. Last week, Tommy at school showed me an article calling you crazy. for giving away your money. I told him, you're not crazy. You just finally remembered how to love people instead of money. Dominic felt tears in his eyes. When had his son gotten so wise? The next morning, Dominic called an emergency meeting with his legal team. But instead of meeting at the office, he had them come to the school. Before we discuss strategy, he told them, I want you to see something. He led them through the halls, showing them the classrooms designed for children who needed extra help. Catching up. The medical office where kids could get checkups and medicine their families couldn't afford. The cafeteria where every child would get 3 meals a day. This isn't just a school, he explained. It's a second chance. The kind of chance David got when he found me. The kind of chance every child deserves. His lawyers looked at each other, then at the portrait of Sarah smiling down at them. Mr. Hayes, his head lawyer said slowly, I think it's time we fight fire with fire. What do you mean? Your father's power comes from his connections, but you have something he doesn't, a story people want to believe in. Let's take this public. Let people see what he's really trying to destroy. And so they did. Dominic and David gave interviews. They invited reporters to tour the school. They let people see the truth, not just about Richard's attempts to stop them, but about why the school mattered so much. Other wealthy families, touched by their story, began pledging support. Children's rights organizations offered to help fight the legal battles. Even some of Richard's old friends started distancing themselves from him, not wanting to be seen opposing such a worthy cause. But the most powerful moment came when David spoke at a press conference. Standing tall despite his nervousness, he told his story. Before I found my dad, my real dad, Dominic, I was alone and scared. My mum worked so hard to give me a good life, but sometimes hard work isn't enough when nobody will give you a chance. That's what this school is about, giving kids like me a chance. The video went viral. Dr. Save Sarah Martinez School started trending on social media. Richard Hayes' carefully crafted reputation began crumbling as people learned the truth about how he had treated his own family. One evening, as they sat in what would be the school's rooftop garden, David asked, Dad, do you think Grandpa Richard ever loved anyone? Dominic thought about it. I think he loved power and money and his idea of what our family should be. But real love, the kind that makes you want to help others. I don't think he ever understood that. That's sad, David said simply. Yes, it is. Dominic touched his bracelet. But you know what? Sometimes it takes losing everything to find what really matters. I was becoming just like him before I found you. David leaned against his father's shoulder. Do you think the school will really open on time? I don't know, buddy, but I promise you this, it will open. Maybe not next week, maybe not next month, but it will open. Because your mom was right. Good people do win in the end. As the sun set over New York City, casting an orange glow over the nearly finished school, father and son sat together, their matching bracelets glinting in the fading light. They had faced down threats and lies, hatred and fear, but they had something Richard Hayes would never understand. Love that was stronger than money, stronger than power, stronger than hate. And in the end, that would make all the difference. The morning of the court hearing dawned cold and grey. Dominic adjusted David's tie in the courthouse bathroom, trying to hide his own nervousness. Remember, buddy, no matter what happens today, we're family, David finished. Nothing can change that. The courtroom was packed. Richard Hayes sat at one table with his expensive lawyers. Dominic and David sat at another, surrounded by their legal team and supporters from the community. Judge Eleanor Martinez, no relation to Sarah, but Dominic saw it as a good sign, looked over her glasses at the assembled crowd. This is a hearing to address the injunction filed by Richard Hayes against the opening of the Sarah Martinez School, she announced. Mr. Hayes Sr., your lawyers may present their case. Richard's lead lawyer stood up, smooth and polished, in his $1,000 suit. Your Honor, we intend to prove that Dominic Hayes has become mentally unstable. His sudden personality changes, his reckless financial decisions, his obsession with this school project. These are signs of a man who is no longer capable of making rational decisions. David squeezed his father's hand under the table. Furthermore, the lawyer continued, we have evidence that Hayes Industries funds were improperly used in the early stages of this project. We request a full audit and psychiatric evaluation before any children are put at risk. Judge Martinez nodded. And your evidence? Richard's lawyers presented financial documents, photos of Dominic's erratic behavior, playing in the park with David eating at simple diners, working alongside construction crews at the school site. Finally, Richard himself took the stand. Your Honor, he said gravely, as a father, it breaks my heart to be here, but I have watched my son spiral into instability since taking in this boy. He pointed at David. He's thrown away his reputation, his fortune, everything we built together, all for some misguided attempt to atone for his brother's death. Objection, Dominic's lawyer stood up. Mr. Hayes is editorializing. Sustained, Judge Martinez said. Please stick to the facts, Mr. Hayes. But before Richard could continue, the courtroom doors burst open. An elderly man shuffled in, supported by a nurse. I need to speak, he wheezed, about Richard Hayes and what he did to that poor girl. Dominic recognized him, James Parker, his father's former chauffeur. Your Honor, Richard's lawyer protested, this is irregular. I've been holding this in for 10 years, James said. Since the day Mr. Hayes ordered me to drive Sarah Martinez to the bus station. He gave her an envelope of cash and told her if she ever contacted his sons, he'd make sure she lost her baby. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Richard's face turned red. I have proof, James continued, holding up an old cell phone. I recorded it. I couldn't sleep at night knowing what he did, but I was afraid. He said he'd ruin my family if I ever told. Judge Martinez held up her hand for silence. Mr. Parker, are you willing to testify under oath? Yes, Your Honor. And there's more. The money he gave Sarah, it wasn't company funds. It was his personal account. The same account he's using now to pay people to lie about his son. Richard jumped to his feet. This is absurd. He's senile, confused. Sit down, Mr. Hayes, Judge Martinez ordered. Then she turned to David. Young man, would you come up here, please? David walked to the judge's bench, his back straight, his golden bracelet catching the light. David, the judge said gently, I've read a lot about you, about your mother's struggles, about finding your uncle, your father now. Can you tell me, in your own words, what this school means to you? David took a deep breath. It means that my mom didn't die for nothing, that her dreams for me, for other kids like me, can come true. It means that sometimes the worst things in life can lead to the best things if you don't give up hope. He touched his bracelet. My first dad gave this to my mom to show her she was family. My new dad wears the matching one to show that love is stronger than money or power or hate. That's what the school is about. Giving love a chance to be stronger than all the bad stuff. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Even some of Richard's lawyers looked uncomfortable. Judge Martinez smiled. Thank you, David. She turned to the room. I've heard enough. The injunction is denied. Furthermore, I'm ordering an investigation into Richard Hayes' actions regarding Sarah Martinez and his grandson. She looked directly at Richard. Mr. Hayes, attempting to destroy a school for underprivileged children to satisfy a personal vendetta is despicable. Using your wealth and influence to harm your own family is unforgivable. Richard stood up, straightening his tie. This isn't over, he said coldly. Yes, Father, it is. Dominic's voice was quiet but firm. You've lost. Not just the court case, but everything. Look around. Look at what your money and power have gotten you. You're alone. No one's afraid of you anymore. As if to prove his point, Richard's lawyers were already packing their briefcases, avoiding their client's eyes. David walked over to his grandfather. I'm sorry you don't know how to love people, he said simply. It must be really lonely. But if you ever want to learn, the school will be open to everyone, even you. Richard stormed out without another word, but his power was broken. His secrets were exposed. The mighty Richard Hayes had finally met something he couldn't buy or bully: the truth. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded around Dominic and David. What does this mean for the school? Will it open on schedule? How do you feel about your father's actions? Dominic lifted David onto his shoulders, just like he used to do with his brother when they were boys. The Sarah Martinez School will open next week as planned, and every child who comes through those doors will learn what my son taught me, that love is the greatest power in the world. David grinned down at his father, their matching bracelets glinting in the sunlight that had finally broken through the clouds. "Can we go to the school?" he asked. "I want to tell Mom the good news." "You bet, buddy." Dominic started walking, ignoring the reporters calling after them. "I think your mom already knows, but let's go tell her anyway." As they drove to the school site, David hummed happily in the back seat. The worst was over. The future they had dreamed of was finally secure, and somewhere Dominic was sure Sarah and his brother were celebrating, too. Their family had won. Love had won, just like Sarah always said it would. The morning of the Sarah Martinez School's opening ceremony was perfect. Sunshine streamed through the big windows, making the newly polished floors gleam. Hundreds of chairs filled the main courtyard, all facing the stage where Sarah's portrait hung as a backdrop. David stood in front of the mirror in their new apartment. The top floor of the school building had been converted into a beautiful home for them. Mrs. Rodriguez fussed with his tie while Dominic watched from the doorway. "I'm nervous, Dad," David admitted. "What if I mess up my speech?" "Just speak from your heart," Dominic said, "like your mom would." The courtyard was already filling up when they went downstairs. Former street kids and their families sat next to some of New York's wealthiest citizens. Reporter cameras flashed. But the most important guests were the 100 children who would be starting classes the next day, kids who, like David, just needed a chance. Mayor Thompson stepped up to the podium first. "Today," she announced, "we're not just opening a school. We're opening doors of opportunity. We're changing lives. And it all started because a little boy with a golden bracelet reminded one of our city's most powerful men what really matters in life." Dominic squeezed David's shoulder as the mayor continued. "But I'm not the best person to tell this story. Instead, I'd like to introduce you to two very special people, Dominic Hayes Thompson and his son, David." The applause was thunderous as David and Dominic walked to the podium together. David had to stand on a small box to reach the microphone, making everyone smile. "A year ago," David began, his voice shaky at first but growing stronger, "I was homeless. My mom had died and I thought I was all alone in the world. Then one day I got really hungry and walked into a fancy restaurant. I met a man who seemed really mean at first, but then he saw this." David held up his wrist, the golden bracelet gleaming. "This bracelet belonged to my first dad, who died before I was born. His brother, my new dad, had one just like it, and that's when everything changed." Dominic stepped forward, holding up his matching bracelet. "My brother David and I got these bracelets when we were kids. They were supposed to remind us that family is the most important thing in life. But somewhere along the way, I forgot that lesson. I forgot a lot of important lessons." He looked at his son with tears in his eyes. "Then this amazing boy found me. He and his mother, Sarah Martinez, taught me that real wealth isn't about money. It's about love, about helping others, about making the world a little better than you found it." David took over again. "That's what this school is for. Mom always said that education is the key to changing your life. But sometimes kids like me don't get a chance at good schools. Sometimes we just need someone to believe in us." The audience was silent now, many wiping away tears. "So this school," David continued, "is for every kid who needs a chance. Every mom working 3 jobs to give their children a better life. Every family that's struggling but not giving up. My mom used to say that love is stronger than anything, stronger than money, stronger than fear, stronger than hate. This school is proof that she was right." Just then, a familiar figure appeared at the back of the crowd. Richard Hayes stood there looking older and somehow smaller than before. He wasn't trying to cause trouble. He just watched, his face unreadable. David saw him too. Without hesitating, he added, "And it's for everyone who needs to learn how to love. Because it's never too late to change, never too late to become better than you were yesterday." Richard's eyes met Dominic's. For a moment, father and son looked at each other across the crowded courtyard. Then Richard gave a small nod and quietly left. The ceremony continued with ribbon cutting and tours of the school. The new students ran excited through the halls, picking out their classrooms. Parents cried happy tears, knowing their children would finally get the education they deserved. Later that evening, after all the guests had gone, Dominic and David sat in their favorite spot, the rooftop garden. The city lights twinkled around them like stars. "Dad," David said quietly, "do you think we'll see Grandpa?" "Richard again." "I don't know, buddy. But you were right. It's never too late to change. Maybe someday he'll understand what you taught me." "What did I teach you?" Dominic smiled, touching his bracelet. "That the most valuable things in life can't be bought. That real happiness comes from helping others. That love is the greatest power in the world." David leaned against his father's shoulder. "Mom would be so proud of us." "She is proud of us, son. Her and your dad both." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the city below. Tomorrow the halls would fill with children's laughter. Tomorrow dreams would begin coming true. Tomorrow Sarah Martinez's legacy would live on in every life touched by her school. "Hey, Dad," David said suddenly. "I just realized something. Remember when you found me in that restaurant? You said I was pathetic for begging." "Son, I'm so sorry for—" "No, listen," David grinned. "You were right, I was begging. I was begging for food because I was hungry. But really I was begging for something else too." "What's that?" "A family. And look what I got. The best dad in the world." Dominic hugged his son tight, their matching bracelets catching the starlight. Below them, the Sarah Martinez School stood ready to change lives. Above them, the stars twinkled like Sarah's eyes in her portrait, and between them, love flowed strong and pure and endless. They had lost everything to find what really mattered. They had faced hatred to discover love. They had been broken to become whole, and now finally they were home. In her portrait in the school's entrance, Sarah Martinez smiled down at everyone who entered. Her dream had come true in ways she could never have imagined. Her son was safe and loved. Her name would help other children find their way. And the man she had once known as her boyfriend's angry brother had become the father she had always hoped her son would have. The golden bracelets that had brought them together would continue to shine, reminding everyone who saw them that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't the ones you can buy. Sometimes they're the ones you find when you've lost everything else. And that's how the story of a little boy with a golden bracelet changed not just 2 lives, but countless others. Because love, as Sarah always said, is the strongest power in the world. It can heal broken hearts, mend broken families, and even teach the coldest businessman in New York how to be warm again. All it takes is a chance, a golden bracelet, and a heart brave enough to love.